A desperate cry for help. Jake Carter walked alone across the empty wasteland of a strange planet. His boots crunched against the dry, cracked ground. The sky above was a deep shade of red, with two suns burning in the distance. His oxygen gauge blinked on his wrist, a warning. He had about an hour left before he needed to return to his ship. Just as he was about to turn back, a weak, crackling sound came through his helmet radio. "Help, please, someone, help me." Jake stopped. He wasn't expecting to hear another voice, especially not here, on a dead world. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the horizon. There was nothing but jagged rocks and endless dust. "Who's there?" Jake asked, adjusting his radio. No answer, just heavy, labored breathing. Whoever it was, they were dying. Jake checked his tracker. A faint distress signal blinked on his screen. It wasn't far. Without wasting another second, he ran toward the source. As he climbed over a small ridge, he spotted the wreckage of a crashed ship. The metal was twisted and scorched, half buried in the sand. Smoke rose from the wreck, and beside it, barely moving, was someone trapped under debris. It wasn't human. Jake's breath caught in his throat. The figure had smooth violet skin, long silver hair, and glowing blue eyes. Strange markings ran down her arms, and her breathing was slow and painful. She was an alien. Jake had seen many species in his travels, but none like this. Her kind was unknown to humans. "Hey, can you hear me?" he called, stepping closer. The alien girl's eyes flickered open. She tried to move, but the wreckage pinned her down. She gasped in pain. Please, help. They're coming," she whispered. Jake's heart pounded. Who was coming? "I'll get you out," he said, kneeling beside her. He pushed against the metal, but it wouldn't budge. "Hang on." He grabbed a small plasma cutter from his belt and activated it. A bright beam of energy shot out, slicing through the wreckage. The alien girl winced as Jake cut away the debris. Her breathing grew weaker. "Stay with me," Jake said. Her head tilted slightly, her glowing blue eyes locking onto his. There was something haunting in her gaze. Fear, exhaustion, and a silent plea for help. Jake didn't know her species, didn't know her story. But she was alone and afraid. And Jake had never been the kind of man to walk away from someone in need. As he worked, he spoke. "What's your name?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leora." "Okay, Leora. Almost there." The last piece of metal fell away, and Jake quickly checked her injuries. Her leg was bruised and swollen, but not broken. She could still walk if she had support. "I'm gonna carry you out of here," he said. Before she could answer, a low, guttural growl echoed across the wasteland. Jake froze. Lyra's fingers dug into his arm. Her whole body tensed. "They're here," she whispered. Jake turned his head slowly. In the distance, dark shapes moved through the dust. Their red eyes glowed, and their bodies were twisted, insect-like, with long, sharp claws. Predators. Jake lifted Leora into his arms. She was light, but her body trembled with pain. "Hold on," he said, adjusting his grip. The creatures moved faster, their claws scraping against the rocks. Jake started running. Sand kicked up around him as he sprinted toward the nearest ridge. Leora let out a weak gasp, but she didn't fight him. Behind them, the creatures let out a piercing screech. They were closing in. Jake gritted his teeth. His oxygen was low, his body was exhausted, and he had no idea what these monsters were. But one thing was clear: if he didn't find shelter fast, they were both dead. Escape before the hunters arrive. Jake Carter ran across the cracked ground, his boots sinking into the loose sand as he carried the alien girl in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, and her glowing blue eyes flickered open, but she was too weak to hold on. Behind them, the hunters moved fast. Dark, insect-like creatures with glowing red eyes and razor-sharp claws. Their bodies were covered in black, chitinous armor, their movements eerily smooth as they crawled over the wreckage and began pursuing. Jake's heart pounded. He had seen dangerous creatures before, but these things moved like trained killers. Fast, silent, and with terrifying precision. "What are they?" Jake asked, keeping his pace steady as he climbed a steep dune. Lyra coughed weakly. "Bioweapons, created to hunt my kind." Jake felt a chill down his spine. Created. Someone had made these things. He glanced over his shoulder. The creatures had reached the base of the dune. Their clawed hands sank into the sand, pulling them up at an unnatural speed. One of them let out a low, guttural snarl, and another creature answered with a sharp, clicking noise. They were communicating. Jake cursed under his breath. He needed a plan, and fast. His oxygen gauge blinked again. Low levels. The ridge ahead was their only hope. If they could reach it, they might find shelter. But Lyra was barely conscious, and the creatures were closing in. He had to slow them down. Jake reached for his shock grenades, strapped to his belt. He had 2 left. He adjusted the timer on one and tossed it behind them as he ran. A loud boom shook the ground, sending a shockwave through the sand. The creatures screeched in rage as the pulse disrupted their movements, forcing them to scatter for a moment. But it wasn't enough. The fastest one recovered instantly, leaping forward. Its claws swiped at Jake's back, nearly tearing into his suit. Jake dropped low, skidding in the sand, and fired his sidearm. A blue energy bolt hit the creature in the chest, but instead of dropping, it absorbed the blast, its kitten glowing for a brief second. "They have shields," Jake muttered in disbelief. Lyra stirred. "Kinetic energy won't stop them. They adapt." Jake gritted his teeth. "Great. Now she tells me." The ridge was 10 meters away, but the creatures were faster. They had to do something now. "Lyra, can you walk?" Jake asked, lowering her slightly so she could try. She groaned, but her legs were too weak. "No, not yet." "No choice." Then, Jake threw his second grenade and braced himself. Boom. The creatures hesitated, just long enough for Jake to reach the edge of the ridge. He skidded to a stop, glancing down. Below was a steep drop-off, leading to a dry river filled with jagged rocks. No way down, except to jump. Better than getting ripped apart. Jake tightened his grip around Lyra. "Hold your breath." Before she could protest, he jumped. The wind rushed past them as they plummeted down the rocky slope. Jake twisted midair, making sure he landed on his back to protect Lyra. Crash. Pain shot through Jake's body as he slammed into the ground, rolling several times before coming to a stop. His suit absorbed some of the impact, but not all of it. His ribs screamed in protest. Lyra groaned softly, her eyes fluttering open. She was still alive. Above them, the creatures reached the ridge, staring down at them with glowing red eyes. For a long moment, they didn't move. Jake held his breath. Had they given up? Then one of the hunters let out a low clicking sound, and suddenly, the creatures began climbing down the cliffs. Fast. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake muttered. Lyra's hand weakly gripped his sleeve. "We have to keep moving." Jake forced himself up, biting back the pain. A dust storm was rolling in from the west. If they could reach it, maybe, just maybe, it would hide them long enough to escape. But the hunters were relentless. And they weren't done yet. Hunted across the wasteland, Jake Carter struggled to stay on his feet. His body ached from the fall, his oxygen levels were dropping, and he could still hear the screeching of the hunters above. He had been in bad situations before, but this was survival against something unnatural. Beside him, Lyra groaned softly. Her breathing was uneven, her glowing blue eyes dull with exhaustion. She tried to push herself up, but her body was too weak. We have to keep moving," she whispered. Jake nodded, forcing himself forward. The dry river stretched ahead, a twisting path of jagged rocks and loose sand. The dust storm in the distance was their only hope. If they reached it, they might be able to hide. But above them, the hunters had already started their descent. They moved like shadows, slithering down the cliffside with terrifying speed. Their clawed hands found grips in the rock, their bodies twisting unnaturally. Their glowing red eyes never left their targets, never blinking, never hesitating. Jake tightened his grip around Leora's arm, helping her stand. "Come on," he muttered. "I know you're hurt, but if we stay here—" A sharp clicking noise echoed above. Jake turned just in time to see one of the hunters leaping down toward them. He yanked Leora aside as the creature landed where they had just been. A cloud of dust rose around it, but the hunter didn't even flinch. It straightened, its head tilting in an eerily slow motion, its red eyes locking onto them. Then it lunged. Jake fired his pistol, aiming for the eyes this time. The energy blast struck, making the creature stagger back. It let out a distorted mechanical snarl, not pain, but frustration. Leora clutched Jake's arm. She coughed. "They're not just creatures, they're machines." Jake's stomach tightened. That explained their speed, their coordination. These weren't wild predators. They were built for this. A second hunter dropped down, then a third. Jake grabbed Leora's hand. "Run." They bolted across the riverbed, feet slipping on the unstable ground. The dust storm ahead was growing stronger, its winds howling like a living creature. If they reached it, the hunters might lose sight of them. But the hunters were faster. One of them sprang forward, its claws swiping at Jake's leg. He barely dodged, stumbling forward. Another hunter tried to cut off their path, moving in from the right. Jake took a gamble. With his free hand, he grabbed his last energy grenade and threw it directly at the nearest hunter. Boom! The shockwave sent the hunter flying backward, but the others kept coming. Then, Leora stopped. Jake nearly crashed into her. "What the hell are you?" She stretched out a hand toward the sand, her eyes flickering with something strange. A faint hum filled the air, and suddenly, the ground shifted. The sand beneath them trembled, then collapsed inward. Jake barely had time to react before he and Leora were falling. Beneath the wasteland, Jake hit the ground hard, rolling before coming to a stop. Dust filled his lungs as he coughed, trying to push himself up. They had fallen into some kind of underground cavern. The walls glowed faintly, strange symbols carved into the rock. The air here was different, heavier. He turned to Leora. What the hell was that? She was on her hands and knees, breathing heavily. Her violet skin shimmered faintly in the dim light. I didn't know if it would work," she admitted. Jake frowned. "You made the ground collapse." Leora nodded weakly. "This place. My people were here once. The energy still lingers." Jake looked around. The cavern stretched deep into the earth, old ruins hidden beneath the sand. This wasn't just a random hole in the ground. This was something ancient. Then, from above, came the sound of scraping metal. Jake's stomach dropped. The hunters were still up there. One of them peered down into the hole, its red eyes scanning the darkness. Jake held his breath. If they jumped down, they were trapped. For a long, agonizing moment, the creature just stared. Then, it let out a low, distorted growl. Slowly, it backed away. Jake let out a breath. "Are they leaving?" Leora didn't answer. Her expression was tense. Too tense. And then, Jake saw it. Something else was moving in the darkness. He turned, his pulse spiking. Deep within the cavern, something massive shifted in the shadows. A faint, rhythmic thrum echoed through the air, like a heartbeat. Jake instinctively reached for his weapon. "Leora, what is that?" She swallowed hard. "I don't know." A pair of blue eyes flickered open in the dark. And then the ground shook. A secret hidden beneath the sands. The cavern trembled, dust and small rocks raining from above as something massive stirred in the darkness. Jake instinctively raised his pistol, heart pounding. He had already faced one deadly enemy today. He wasn't eager to meet another. Beside him, Leora stiffened. Her breathing quickened, her glowing blue eyes locked onto the shifting shadows. Then the sound came. A deep, rhythmic thrum, like the pulse of something ancient. It wasn't mechanical, but it wasn't quite alive either. It reverberated through the cavern, sending a low vibration through Jake's bones. Then the eyes opened. Not red like the hunters, blue. Soft, glowing blue light shining from deep within the cavern. It wasn't one pair of eyes. It was dozens. Jake clenched his jaw. Great. More surprises. He took a step forward, gripping his weapon. Leora, do you know what this is? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze flickered across the walls, studying the ancient symbols carved into the stone. Some were cracked, barely visible, but others still pulsed with faint bioluminescent energy. I think this is one of the last strongholds of my people, she whispered. A place of refuge, hidden beneath the sands. My ancestors must have built it long ago. Jake glanced at the shifting blue lights, still deep in the cavern's shadows. And them. Leora exhaled slowly. If this place is still active, they might be the Guardians. Jake frowned. Guardians? Before she could answer, the figures moved. The glowing eyes shifted, and from the darkness emerged tall, humanoid figures, covered in intricate, silver armor, their bodies sleek and semi-organic, like something grown rather than built. They moved with an eerie grace, silent but powerful. Jake raised his weapon. I'm guessing they won't be happy to see us. Leora shook her head. They won't attack unless they see us as a threat. Jake let out a slow breath. Yeah. Well, I don't think I'm their favorite guest. One of the guardian figures stepped closer. Unlike the hunters, they didn't snarl or screech. Instead, it simply observed. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite machine, it spoke. Outsider, why do you trespass upon sacred ground? Jake tensed. The voice was deep, layered, like multiple tones speaking at once. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't welcoming either. Leora, still weak, forced herself to step forward. We seek safety, she said. Her voice wavered, but her tone was firm. The hunters, they follow us. The Guardian's head tilted slightly. Hunters. It repeated the word as if testing it. Then it turned, gesturing to the walls. The symbols began to glow brighter, illuminating the cavern fully for the first time. Jake's eyes widened. The walls weren't just carved with ancient writing. They were covered in depictions of war. Leora gasped softly. This is history. Jake stepped closer, studying the carvings. They showed her people, tall, elegant, advanced, fighting against monstrous creatures. The same insect-like hunters that had been chasing them above. Only here, there were thousands of them. Leora traced her fingers over a specific symbol, a large, circular artifact. Energy radiated from it, pushing back the hunters. This was a weapon, she murmured. Jake narrowed his eyes. And I'm guessing it was the only thing that kept these things in check. The Guardian turned its glowing gaze toward Leora. Your people sealed them away, it said. But the seal has weakened. Jake swore under his breath. So let me guess. The hunters are back, and we're standing in the one place that knows how to stop them. The Guardian nodded. Leora looked up, her expression shifting from fear to determination. If we can activate the artifact, we can fight back. Jake crossed his arms. Okay, and how do we do that? The Guardian hesitated. Then it spoke one final word before the cavern shook violently. Bloodline. A deep rumble split through the ground, shaking the ancient ruins as dust and debris began to fall. From above, the echoing screeches of the hunters returned. They had found the way down. Leora gasped. They're coming. Jake gritted his teeth, heart pounding. He didn't know what this artifact was, or what the Guardian meant by bloodline, but one thing was clear. If they didn't act now, there wouldn't be anything left to save. The last stand, and a shocking revelation. The cavern shook violently, cracks spider webbing across the ancient stone walls as the hunters above tore their way inside. Dust and debris rained down, the once silent sanctuary now filled with the echoes of screeches and the deep hum of energy pulsing from the hidden artifact. Jake Carter clenched his fists, scanning the carved murals for any clue on what to do next. The Guardian's words echoed in his head. Bloodline. Beside him, Leora was pale, her glowing blue eyes locked on the artifact's depiction. The circular relic, an ancient energy core, was the only thing her people had ever used to stop the hunters. But if the Guardian was right, it would only respond to her bloodline, which meant she was the key. Above them, the hunters had arrived. One by one, shadowy figures dropped down from the breach in the cavern ceiling, their red eyes glowing like burning embers in the dark. Their sharp, clawed limbs scraped against the stone, and their movements were eerily fluid, like shadows given form. Jake instinctively raised his pistol, but he knew energy weapons didn't work against them. These things adapted. They learned. Leora turned to the Guardian. How do I activate the artifact? The armored figure stepped forward, light radiating from its chest as it examined her. Your kind sealed it away to protect the last of your people. Only one of the royal bloodline may command it. Jake's heart sank. Royal bloodline. That complicated things. Leora swallowed hard. I'm not. She hesitated, then straightened. My family was never part of the ruling houses. I don't. The Guardian cut her off. There is no one else left. Jake turned back toward the hunters. More of them were pouring in now, their low, guttural clicks echoing as they scanned the cavern. They were searching, studying. Then, the largest of them moved forward. Jake stiffened. This one was different. Bigger. Stronger. Its exoskeleton was thicker, its red eyes filled with something deeper than just mindless hunger. It studied them. And then, it spoke. You will surrender. The words sent a chill down Jake's spine. The voice was layered, distorted, mechanical, and somehow wrong. Leora tensed beside him. They've evolved. The leader of the hunters tilted its head slightly, watching her closely. You are the last. It took a slow step forward. Your kind is finished. We will complete our purpose. Jake aimed his pistol anyway, even though he knew it was useless. Yeah. Well, I hate unfinished jobs. The creature didn't even glance at him. It only had eyes for Leora. Jake's grip tightened. He knew that look. It wasn't hunger. It wasn't even bloodlust. It was extermination. They weren't just here to kill Leora. They were here to erase her existence entirely. The hunters moved as one. Jake shoved Leora behind him, raising his arm to shield her as the creatures leaped. Then everything exploded in light. The power awakens. A shockwave of blue energy erupted from Leora's body, sending the hunters flying backward. The cavern flashed with ancient runes igniting across the walls, glowing with power that hadn't been touched in centuries. Jake gasped, shielding his eyes. The Guardian lowered to one knee. The artifact had chosen its wielder. Leora stood at the center of it all, bathed in shimmering blue light. The runes on her arms, once dormant, now pulsed like living energy. The hunters hissed in alarm. The leader took a step back, its claws flexing in uncertainty. Jake grinned. Yeah. Didn't see that coming, did you? Leora's breathing was heavy, but her voice was clear and steady. You hunted my people. You destroyed my home. And now you think I'll just let you finish the job. She lifted her hand, and the cavern responded. The artifact's core, buried beneath the ancient floor, rose from the ground. It was massive, spinning with raw power, its surface covered in glowing inscriptions. The Guardian finally spoke again. The final seal has been unlocked. Jake barely had time to react before the energy surged outward. The cavern erupted in a wave of force, slamming into the hunters. They screamed as their bodies disintegrated, breaking apart into fragments of shadow and metal, unable to withstand the ancient power. The leader resisted. It dug its claws into the stone, its red eyes flaring as it fought against the energy tearing at its form. "We cannot be stopped." Lyora's gaze hardened. She raised her hand, and the energy of the artifact collapsed inward, forming a singular, blinding pulse. Then she released it all at once. The leader of the hunters let out a final, distorted shriek before it was obliterated. Aftermath. Jake coughed, pushing himself up as the cavern settled. The artifact had gone still, its energy humming at a low, steady pulse. The hunters were gone. Lyra stood, her body glowing faintly, her breaths shallow but steady. Jake let out a slow exhale. Well, that was new. She turned, meeting his gaze. "It's not over." Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "The hunter's heir." Leora shook her head. "This was just one of their forces. If they were still hunting me, it means something worse is coming." Jake ran a hand through his hair, already regretting his next question. "How much worse?" The Guardian finally spoke. "The war is beginning again." Jake groaned. "Of course it is." Leora stared at the artifact, a mix of fear and determination in her eyes. "Then we have to fight." Jake smirked, cracking his knuckles. "Now you're speaking my language." The dust settled, the silence of the cavern hanging heavy. The war wasn't over. It was just getting started. The arrival of an unknown force. The cavern hummed with residual energy, the glowing inscriptions on the walls slowly fading after the battle. The last of the hunters had been obliterated, their twisted remains nothing more than blackened ash scattered across the ancient stone floor. Yet, despite the silence, Jake Carter felt no relief. He looked at Leora. She stood at the center of the chamber, the artifact's core still pulsing faintly behind her. The glow along her skin had dimmed, but the power that had awakened within her was still there, alive, waiting. Leora turned to face him, her blue eyes filled with both determination and something else. Something deeper. Fear. Jake crossed his arms. "All right, you said this wasn't over. Wanna explain why?" Leora exhaled slowly, her fingers grazing the floating artifact. "This wasn't just a hunter squad," she murmured. "This was a scouting force." Jake stiffened. "You mean they weren't the main attack?" Leora nodded. "They came to confirm something." Jake frowned. "Confirm what?" She hesitated. Then, her fingers traced one of the glowing inscriptions on the stone wall, revealing a hidden marking that had been buried under dust and time. Jake squinted at the symbol. It was different from the others. A star-like sigil with branching lines. It didn't just look ancient, it looked forgotten. "The hunters were searching for the artifact," Leora said. "For me. But they weren't just hunting me to eliminate the last of my people. They wanted to be sure that I exist." Jake's stomach twisted. "Why?" Leora turned, her expression solemn. "Because if I exist, it means my people's greatest enemy still fears us." Before Jake could ask more, the cavern shook violently. The ground trembled, and an unnatural hum filled the air, a sound too deep, too vast to come from the ruins themselves. It vibrated through the stone, through their bones. Jake's instincts screamed at him. He had been in war zones, seen planetary bombardments, and fought in skirmishes across countless systems. This wasn't just an explosion. This was something worse. Lyra's eyes widened. "They're here." Jake grabbed her arm. "Who?" "The hunters." Leora shook her head. "No, something older." The Guardian, still kneeling in the chamber, suddenly looked up. Its glowing blue eyes flashed. For the first time, its voice held something other than calm detachment. It held urgency. "The Watchers have come." Jake had no idea who the Watchers were, but he was willing to bet they weren't showing up for a friendly visit. Then the sky cracked open. A sky on fire. Jake and Leora barely made it outside the ruins before the first wave of energy tore across the sky. The wasteland, once an endless stretch of dry earth and jagged rock, was now bathed in a terrible burning light. The air hummed with unnatural force, and above them, hovering in the atmosphere like a silent god, was a colossal ship. Jake had seen big ships before. He had been on human dreadnoughts, seen battleships the size of cities. But this thing wasn't made. It was grown. The vessel pulsed with veins of black and silver metal, its surface shifting like it was alive. Its shape was almost organic, like a leviathan from the depths of space, ancient and terrifying. Jake's breath caught. "What the hell is that?" Lyra's voice was barely a whisper. "A watcher vessel." Jake looked at her. "You mind telling me why the sky just cracked open and a nightmare ship decided to show up?" Lyra's fists clenched. "Because the artifact woke up. And now, so have they." Jake swallowed hard. The colossal vessel was descending, its sheer size blotting out the stars as it loomed over the ruined wasteland. Energy crackled across its hull, and for the first time, Jake realized it wasn't alone. Several smaller ships, black, predatory-looking craft, peeled away from the main structure, diving toward the planet's surface. Jake's instincts screamed. They were landing. "We need to move," he said sharply. "Now." Leora didn't argue. She was already moving, her weakened body pushed beyond its limits. The energy from the artifact had given her strength, but she was still recovering. Jake grabbed his communicator, flipping channels. His ship wasn't far, but it sure as hell wasn't close enough. A deep, resonating tone filled the air. Jake froze. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a message. A voice, deep, layered, and ancient, filled the air. "The lost child of the stars. We have come for you." Jake and Leora stopped cold. The voice wasn't coming from the ships. It was inside their heads. Lyra's breathing hitched. They know me." Jake gritted his teeth. "Yeah, that's great. But I don't think they're here to invite you for a cup of tea." From the descending ships, figures emerged. Tall, towering warriors, clad in dark, shifting armor, stepped onto the surface of the wasteland. Their eyes burned with a light Jake had never seen before. Not red like the hunters, not blue like the guardians. They were white. Cold. Empty. The Watchers had arrived. And the war that had been buried beneath the sands had just begun. A human's choice changes everything. The sky was on fire. The colossal Watcher vessel loomed overhead, its massive form blotting out the stars. Energy pulsed across its surface, shifting like liquid metal, veins of black and silver glowing with unreadable alien inscriptions. Smaller ships, sleek and predatory, had already landed, and the Watchers had emerged. They weren't like the hunters. They weren't savage creatures that moved on instinct. They were something far worse. Jake Carter's grip tightened around his sidearm as he took in the tall, armored figures stepping onto the cracked wasteland. Their dark, shifting armor seemed more like living metal, adjusting to the dim light of the planet. Their eyes burned with a light Jake had never seen before, not red like the hunters, not blue like the guardians. White. Cold. Empty. And yet, despite their silence, he could feel them. They weren't just looking at him. They were inside his mind. A voice, layered and ancient, echoed through the air, through his very bones. "The lost child of the stars. You cannot run from fate." Leora shuddered beside him. Her breathing was uneven, her body still weak from unlocking the artifact's power. But her eyes, those glowing blue eyes, held nothing but defiance. Jake took a step forward, putting himself between Leora and the Watchers. He had no idea who they were, no idea what they wanted. But he didn't need to. He already knew one thing. They weren't here to talk. Jake raised his pistol. "Yeah. Well, I don't really care for fate." The lead Watcher cocked its head slightly, as if considering him for the first time. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should have been able to. Jake barely had time to react before the Watcher's hand was around his throat, lifting him off the ground. A jolt of freezing pain shot through his body, like his very soul was being examined, peeled apart layer by layer, his vision blurred. Memories flashed before his eyes. The war he fought in, the friends he lost, the lonely nights drifting in space, searching for a purpose he wasn't sure he'd ever find. Then, something new. Visions of a burning world. A city swallowed by darkness, its people erased from existence. And at the center of it all, Lyora, standing alone. Jake gasped as the Watcher released him, sending him crashing to the ground. He coughed, his entire body shaking as the vision faded. The Watcher didn't speak. It didn't have to. Jake understood. This was a warning. The Watchers had seen something, and Lyora was at the heart of it. The weight of the past. Lyora helped Jake to his feet, her touch warmer than he expected. He met her gaze. "Tell me you saw that too." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I did." Jake exhaled sharply. "All right. Care to explain?" Lyora turned back to the Watchers. "They were the ones who started this war." Jake blinked. "I thought the hunters wiped out your people." Lyora's expression darkened. "They were just weapons. Tools. The Watchers created them." Jake clenched his jaw. Of course. It made sense now. The hunters weren't acting on their own. They were engineered, controlled. And the ones controlling them were standing right in front of him. The lead Watcher stepped forward. "She is the last," it said, voice reverberating through the air. "But she will not be the end." Jake took a step forward, ignoring the pain still racking his body. "Yeah. And what exactly is that supposed to mean?" The Watcher didn't even look at him. It spoke only to Lyora. "The cycle must continue." Jake's stomach twisted. "What cycle?" Lyora's hands clenched into fists. "They destroyed my people once before. And now, they want to do it again." Jake shook his head. "No, they want something else." He turned to the Watchers. "You're not just here to wipe her out. You're afraid of her." The Watcher tilted its head slightly, as if the idea was amusing. "She is a variable we cannot allow." Jake felt his blood run cold. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about war. The Watchers were erasing possibilities. Lyora wasn't just the last of her kind. She was the last chance for something the Watchers didn't want to happen. And that meant one thing. She was a threat to them. A choice that changes everything. Jake slowly raised his weapon again. He knew it was useless. There was no way a pistol was going to stop creatures like this. But that didn't matter. What mattered was what came next. "All right," he said, forcing a smirk. "I've got a counter-offer for you." The Watcher remained silent. Jake took a deep breath. "You want to erase Lyora. You want to erase a possibility." He nodded. "Fine. But here's the thing." He grinned. "You're gonna have to go through me first." Silence. The Watcher slowly tilted its head again, those cold white eyes observing him with something almost like curiosity. Then, Lyora moved. She stepped beside Jake, lifting her hand, and the artifact responded. A pulse of ancient blue energy rippled through the air, wrapping around both of them. The ruins behind them lit up, glowing with the power of her people. Lyora took a slow breath. "I won't run from you." The Watchers remained still. Then, slowly, the lead figure spoke one last time. "So be it." Above, the colossal ship shifted. And then, the sky itself began to break. The war begins. The Watchers vanished in a flash of white light. But their ship remained. And suddenly, the air was filled with movement. Thousands of hunter drones descended from the sky. More ships emerged from the darkness of space, warping in like a storm on the horizon. Jake swallowed hard. "Well, I guess that's our answer." Lyora turned to him, her blue eyes shining. "We fight." Jake smirked. "Hell yeah, we do." The ruins behind them erupted in light, revealing long-buried ships, weapons, and defenses of a long-forgotten empire. Jake cracked his knuckles. All right then, let's give 'em something to be afraid of. The war that had been buried beneath the sands had just begun, and humanity was about to prove why they should never be underestimated.